January 1944. Somewhere in the frozen interior of Germany, the air inside a prison of war camp hangs heavy with coal dust, sweat, and silence. Snow presses itself into the seams of barbed wire and settles on the roof of wooden barracks that breathe frost through every crack. At dawn, a German guard trudges past the watchtower, his boots grinding ice into the dirt, his breath a pale fog in the darkness. His flashlight beam drifts carelessly across crates stacked near the gate, Red Cross parcels, letters from home, discarded clothing. And resting among them, half buried beneath a wool blanket, is a small teddy bear. Lopsided. Worn. Missing one glass eye. Useless at first glance. Just another relic of a life that once existed beyond the fences. The guard barely looks at it. He never touches it. He does not hear the soft whisper of folded paper inside its body. He does not see the stitches that were sewn by trembling fingers under blackout nights. He does not know that within that threadbare shell lies an intelligence report, names, coordinates, flight times, death sentences written in pencil and hope. This bear was not comfort. This bear was a courier. And it was already on its way out. By the winter of 1944, Germany had become a nation of guarded voices and watchful eyes. The war that had once been carried by thunderous columns rolling across Europe was now being fought in ruins, ration lines, and paper trails. The Reich's front lines stretched thousands of kilometers, from the frozen east to blood-soaked beaches of the west, but another battlefield existed far behind those lines, one without shells or artillery. It lived inside barbed wire, between concrete walls, and within the hollow silence of prison camps scattered across German territory. More than 1 million Allied prisoners of war were being held by the Third Reich by mid-war. Housed in an archipelago of stalags, offlags, and RBS commandos that cut across the countryside like traps frozen in time. Among them were fighter pilots shot from burning skies, infantrymen captured in collapsing defenses, commandos dumped into transport trains without explanation, and intelligence officers whose names never appeared on any list. The camps were built to restrain bodies, but they were also built to starve minds, to strip men of movement, information, and hope in equal measure. For Nazi Germany, it was not enough that an enemy soldier was captured. He had to be erased as a threat. And a soldier with knowledge was never harmless. Every camp ran on routine. Roll calls in the frozen dawn. Soup lines that smelled vaguely of turnips and burned water. Letters from home that arrived months late, if they arrived at all. Prisoners were counted. Moved. Watched. And every word they wrote, spoke, or received was filtered through layers of surveillance. Mail was censored relentlessly. German officers leafed through letters searching for codes, patterns, even emotion. Red Cross parcels were rifled through with gloved hands. Clothing was shaken. Shoes were pierced with metal rods. Even hymn books were inspected for uncut pages. Nothing entered a camp without being touched by suspicion. The Reich understood the fundamental danger of communication. Information was oxygen. Without it, prisoners suffocated quietly. With it, even the smallest detail could breathe life into resistance. A guard rotation noted. A train schedule overheard. A Luftwaffe unit spotted through a workshop window. A bomb crater in the distance that meant something somewhere had changed. In war, fragments became strategy. And intelligence even whispered, could change the path of a battle far beyond any camp fence. The German High Command feared something deeply escape, yes, but far more than that, the flow of intelligence outward. Escaped prisoners might return to fight. But informed prisoners could still fight while locked behind wire. The Allies knew this too. Which is why Allied airmen and officers were trained before deployment in observation and retention. Every detail mattered. In briefings before takeoff, pilots were not just taught how to fly, they were taught how to see. Locations of flak batteries. Patterns of searchlights. Numbering on rail cars. direction of long shadows near industrial zones. And if captured, they were told to remember. They were told to store away geography like currency. Because one day, if they returned, this knowledge could become death for a factory or salvation for a bombing crew. And if they could not return, they had to find a way to send it home. Inside the prisoner barracks, life collapsed into a narrow cylinder of endurance. Men aged quickly. Faces sharpened. Hunger did not always scream often, it whispered. Disease moved through bunks like smoke. Lice became a constant companion. Winter soaked bones into brittle things. The only colour came from parcels carefully folded scraps of cloth, tins of powdered milk, chocolate tablets that could be traded like gold, and sometimes, impossibly, toys. Comfort items. Personal effects. Germany allowed this for optics. The outside world needed to believe the camps were humane. Letters and parcels were the regime's advertisement for decency. But the system that allowed comfort also allowed weakness. And the Allies were watching for that weakness. Inside camps, senior officers quietly became network nodes. Men formed observation circles. One prisoner memorized schedules. Another sketched layouts from memory at night using stolen charcoal. Pilots compared notes about airfields they had seen one final time through flame-streaked glass. None of it was written. Not at first. Because writing meant paper. And paper meant evidence. So intelligence lived inside minds like contraband, volatile, vulnerable, fading with every passing week. The Germans thought starvation would dull memory. They were wrong. Hunger sharpened it. And across Europe, long before the first parachute dropped, or the first beach was stormed, Allied intelligence officers were building secret pipelines designed to exploit one assumption the Reich never fully conquered: that weapons came as guns, bombs, or tanks. They did not yet understand that the most dangerous cargo passing through their checkpoints was weightless. They did not yet grasp that the war now moved inside pockets, hemlines, hollowed buttons, slivers of soap, and the stuffed body of a forgotten bear. Because while Germany believed the camps were cages, the Allies saw them as transmitters. And somewhere beyond the forested wire and watchtowers, a system was waiting to listen. Long before Allied bombers darkened the skies over Berlin, a quiet war had already begun beneath the noise of armies. It was a war of maps folded into coat linings, of messages hidden inside soap bars, of numbers disguised as shopping lists and prayers. In December 1939, even before the conflict had fully ignited across Europe, the British government created a secret intelligence department under the War Office, known simply as MI9. Its purpose was brutally narrow and exquisitely dangerous: to assist prisoners of war in escaping and to extract information from behind enemy lines by any means necessary. MI9 did not train commandos. It trained patience. Its officers studied how men lost hope, how guards grew lazy, how systems cracked when they repeated themselves long enough. It developed maps printed on silk so they wouldn't crinkle, compasses embedded in buttons, code systems disguised as family correspondence. Even playing cards were printed with fragments of airbase layouts. MI9 did not invent espionage. It transformed it into something domestic, something disguised as ordinary. Across occupied Europe, courier networks came alive. The Pat O'Leary line ran through southern France, funneling airmen across the Pyrenees into Spain. The Comet lines stitched together Belgium and the Basque Country like a living organism. In the Netherlands, resistance members used underground printing presses to forge identity documents, so convincing they fooled Wehrmacht clerks. Jewish families hid escaped soldiers in attics that were already crowded with the hunted. Belgian rail workers delayed trains by minutes that saved lives. Every safe house was a gamble. Every knock on the door could be Gestapo boots. And yet, these networks didn't just move bodies. They moved paper. Maps copied by candlelight. Order of battle estimates scribbled after whispered conversations in prison yards. Names of collaborators. Layouts of coastal batteries. Details that no camera could capture. Inside POW camps, intelligence wasn't just a byproduct of captivity. It was the mission. German counterintelligence knew this. The Abwehr, Hitler's military intelligence service, devoted entire departments to monitoring POW correspondence. The Gestapo, roaming freely at times, even within camps, interrogated suspected couriers relentlessly. Camp commandants introduced new rules constantly banning personal effects, confiscating drawings, limiting writing materials. Entire barracks were searched without warning. Prisoners were stripped. Mattresses gutted. Shoes dismantled stitch by stitch. But the more Germany locked the gates, the more ingenious the flow became. Censors learned to look for ink between lines. So prisoners began writing on the space between letters. When even that was discovered, milk was used as ink that only revealed itself when heated. When paper ran short, cigarette papers became documents. When books were seized, pages were stitched into clothing. Intelligence adapted the way water does, always finding the lowest, quietest escape. The trick was always this. The intelligence had to leave the camp without being detected, and it had to arrive somewhere that could actually use it. Which meant the courier could not look like a courier. He or she could not look brave. Could not look important. And above all, could not look military. Their cargo had to look worthless. The more pathetic, the better. And that was where personal belongings became weapons. A worn Bible. A half-burnt diary. A child's doll with missing arms. A teddy bear whose fur had faded into grey nothingness. These were not inspected with the same suspicion as tools or books or shoes. They were seen as emotional trash, distractions, touches of home that the Germans believed weakened prisoners rather than hardened them. This misjudgment echoed throughout the entire spy war. The Reich feared guns. It feared radios. It feared sabotage teams. But it never truly feared memory. And it never suspected nostalgia. Red Cross parcels were the arteries of this hidden war. Officially, they delivered food and clothing to prevent famine and disease in camps. Unofficially, they were Trojan horses. MI9 coordinated with charities, religious groups, and diplomatic channels in neutral countries to insert coded items into packages bound for camps. A chocolate bar whose dimensions told a route number. A scarf whose stitches represented letters. A Bible with a map pasted carefully into the binding. Everything followed systems that only insiders could decipher. In some cases, entire escape kits were delivered inside board games' real boards. Real dice but with magnetic compasses and coded instructions hidden beneath the paper. Monopoly sets were famously altered to include silk maps and real money suitable for bribery. Not the kind printed for children, but the kind that could move men across borders. And yet, there were items that passed even more freely than parcels items prisoners could send home. Letters. Family keepsakes. Innocent belongings approved by camp authorities to maintain the illusion of fair treatment. And it was here, in the reverse flow of goods, that some of the most daring operations were born. Prisoners were sending intelligence out of Germany not through sophisticated equipment, but through sentiment. Through home. Through toys and trinkets that had no value in war and every value in memory. A child's scuffed shoe packed into a parcel. A soldier's mother's brooch returned for safekeeping. A broken watch. And sometimes, a teddy bear. Something no officer wanted. Something no interrogator would bother slicing open. Something no list would ever record. By 1944, the Allied intelligence picture of Germany was sharper than it had ever been. Factories. Fuel shortages. New aircraft types. Troop movements. All of it drawn not only from aerial reconnaissance and radio intercepts, but from men living among the enemy in wooden huts with frostbitten fingers and notebooks hidden in their heads. This intelligence shaped bombing runs, informed special operations, saved entire squadrons from flying blind into layered flak traps. These men, deprived of weapons, had become weapons. And while the Reich believed its camps were silencing its enemies, in truth, those camps had become listening posts. And in one of them, among the thousands of parcels and letters and forgotten objects drifting slowly out of Germany under the illusion of mercy, went a bear, soft, helpless, and full of war. From inside a POW camp, the world narrowed to a few square meters of earth, yet the war pressed inward from every direction. To understand how a shapeless, worn teddy bear became a conduit of intelligence, we must look at the event from several angles: human, tactical, and technological, each revealing layers that made such an operation possible, and each exposing the vulnerabilities within the German system that no amount of barbed wire could prevent. The human angle begins with the emotional void inside the camps. For many prisoners, captivity was not defined by chains, but by monotony. Days became mirrors of each other. Roll call, thin soup, work detail, lights out. Isolation was the enemy, as corrosive as hunger. Men clung to small objects to protect the last remnants of their identity: a photograph, a pipe, a lucky charm, a toy. These weren't luxuries. They were anchors. Human beings do not survive on calories alone, they survive on meaning. A teddy bear, even one that looked ridiculous in the hands of an airman or infantry officer, could remind a man of home, of childhood, of the world beyond the watchtower. And because it was an object of affection, guards treated it differently. They saw it not as contraband, but as weakness. Something sentimental, harmless, even pitiful. Their dismissal of it was both a comfort and a weapon. Prisoners learned that anything mocked was safe. Anything ignored could move freely. The human need for attachment became a mask for intelligence. The tactical angle emerges from how prisoners learned to study their captors with forensic precision. A camp was not just a cage, it was a system with rhythms, habits, and blind spots. Guards changed shifts every 8 hours. Sensors rotated every 2 weeks. Certain officers were more meticulous than others. Some grew complacent in winter when their fingers froze. Others let parcels pass with barely a glance when the mail backlog grew overwhelming. Prisoners memorized these patterns the way soldiers once memorized firing arcs and trench maps. They mapped guard routes by the sound of boots. They timed searches by the angle of shadows inside the barracks. They observed which objects drew attention and which were pushed aside. And over time, one truth became clear. The more ordinary an object looked, the more invisible it became. The Germans were trained to suspect structure: hollow crates, false soles, modified tins. They were not trained to suspect softness. Nothing in the Wehrmacht manuals warned them about stuffed toys. Nothing in a guard's training suggested that a frayed bear could be a courier. And tactically, that blindness was decisive. The technological angle exposes the ingenuity hidden in everyday items. Mi-9 innovations were not futuristic, they were deceptively simple. Microfilm, developed long before the war, allowed entire documents to be shrunk to the size of a match head. A set of coordinates, a hand-drawn sketch of a munitions depot, the numbering system of Luftwaffe repair hangars, all could be reduced to near weightless strips. These could be curled, folded, or pressed between layers of cloth. Needles could be used to stitch around them. Thin wires could support the structure without adding bulk. Prisoners who had once repaired parachutes or maintained engine housings used those same hands to open seams and reseal them invisibly. Even mundane tools: a bit of stolen glue, a heated spoon, a hushed whisper in the blackout hours, enabled them to build hiding spaces inside the smallest objects. The teddy bear, with its padding and seams, was a perfect delivery system. Soft enough to conceal irregular shapes. Common enough to avoid suspicion. and intimate enough that a German censor might hesitate to tear it apart unless explicitly ordered. Technology did not need to be complex. It only needed to be underestimated. These three angles, the emotional, the tactical, and the technological, intertwined inside every camp. Together, they created the environment in which a seemingly worthless toy could be transformed into a vessel of war. And as we move deeper into the story, another layer emerges. The people behind the intelligence and the enemy determined to stop them. Beyond the prisoners and their ingenuity stood another force, largely invisible and rarely acknowledged in official histories. The architects of escape and intelligence extraction themselves. This is where the leadership and intelligence angle sharpens into focus. Back in London, MI9 operated like a quiet nerve centre beneath the surface of the British war machine. Unlike divisions that commanded tanks or fleets, MI9 commanded uncertainty. Its officers worked with no guarantees and with men they would never meet. They built networks based not on loyalty but on probability. They assumed betrayal was constant and success was rare. Their duty was not just to extract information, but to preserve hope. Every object smuggled into or out of a camp carried not just intelligence but encouragement, proof that someone was listening, that someone cared, that the war had not forgotten the men inside wire. MI9 officers studied cases of earlier wars. They pored over letters. They identified patterns in what got opened and what didn't. And gradually, a playbook emerged. Anything seen as emotional rather than military flew under the radar. Toys, family items, religious tracts, household clutter. MI9 did not romanticize these methods, they institutionalized them. The teddy bear was not a gimmick. It was a calculated psychological loophole in a security system that did not recognize tenderness as dangerous. Opposing them, relentlessly, stood the enemy angle, the machinery of German suspicion. While the Reichshofen underestimated intimacy, it never lacked cruelty. The Abwehr and Gestapo were not fools. They understood that intelligence moved through POW camps. And they responded the only way they knew how: through fear. Prisoners suspected of espionage were not treated as soldiers. They were treated as conspirators. Interrogations were brutal. Isolation cells were lightless. Food rations vanished. Some men disappeared altogether. Entire barracks could be punished for the actions of one unknown courier. This was not just law enforcement, it was terror as policy. Guards believed in breaking networks by breaking men. Yet the German system suffered from an imbalance. It believed too deeply in force and not deeply enough in subtlety. It stopped men at gates, but not meaning in mundane objects. It shattered radios but ignored stitching. It destroyed tunnels but never questioned teddy bears. This dependence on visible threat made it vulnerable to invisible ones. And while German investigators chased conspiracies in books and boots, the real war walked past them stuffed and silent. The final lens is the moral angle, the quietest but perhaps the weightiest of all. From a distance, it is easy to imagine espionage as sleek and mechanical coded transmissions, agents in trench coats, secret briefcases snapping closed. But inside a camp, espionage looked like trust. Like risking your life on the steady hands of a friend sewing at night. Like placing the fate of dozens inside a seam that might be torn open. Every use of an innocent object as a weapon twisted something existential inside the men who did it. But they did it anyway. They made childhood artifacts dangerous, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. War leaves no clean spaces. It turns everything into either a tool or a casualty. And the deeper cruelty is this: the Germans never realized they were fighting children's toys. That their empire of steel and fire was being pierced by cloth and thread and quiet. This is not poetry. It is fact. History shows again and again that the smallest things often pass through the largest gates. And somewhere inside this web of planning and pressure, there comes a moment. A moment when intelligence stops being theory and becomes reality. A moment when hands shake, not from cold, but from consequence. When thread closes around secrets that cannot be unsaid. When the bear is finished. When it is lifted from a table, weighed briefly in the palm, and prepared for its journey into uncertainty. The night the bear was sealed shut, there was no ceremony. No words spoken louder than breath. The barracks was dark enough that even memory struggled to find its edges. A single sliver of moonlight slipped through warped boards and settled across the floor like frost. Somewhere, a man coughed in his sleep. Another whispered a prayer he no longer believed in. On one lower bunk, hidden behind a blanket strung like a curtain, two sets of hands worked by touch alone. Fingers traced seams carefully, feeling for the thinnest barrier between discovery and escape. Inside the cavity, stitched between padding and fur, were fragments of a world only one side of the war was supposed to see: airfield alignments, factory output estimates, names of guards sympathetic to bribery, rumors of fuel shortages, movements along rail corridors. Not a single page in full. No single piece big enough to betray the others. It was intelligence reduced to dust, to whispers, to fragments designed to survive if only some made it through. At dawn, the package line formed like any other. Prisoners shuffled forward with parcels wrapped in cloth and twine, each marked with addresses written in hands that shook not from cold but from care. The bear rested inside a battered crate among sweaters, books with softened spines, and letters from men too tired to add polish to their handwriting. On the outside, the documentation was immaculate. Every form stamped, every tag correct. The Germans believed order was armor. And here, on paper, everything was in order. When the crate reached the inspection table, the censor opened it lazily, his fingers numbed from hours of rifling through duty. He scanned the contents with mechanical disinterest: clothing, a torn scarf, paperback novels with yellowed pages. Then the teddy bear emerged into the fluorescing light of the room, its glass eye dull and its stitching uneven. He turned it over once. Scoffed. Squeezed its belly out of mockery more than curiosity. It sagged lifelessly in his hands, as if insulted. No metal clinked. No crisp edges betrayed hidden paper. He dropped it back into the crate like trash and stamped approval with a red mark that sounded final in the stale air. From that moment on, there was no undoing what had been set in motion. The bear moved across Germany not by miracle but by schedule. Train lines carried it through rail yards blackened with soot and silence. Postal clerks logged it alongside thousands of packages. No one memorized its number. No one tracked its route. That was its greatest camouflage. It belonged nowhere. It was claimed by no one. It was just one more item drifting in a war filled with lost things. And yet, every mile that clicked beneath steel wheels was another layer peeled away from the Reich's secrets. Each station it passed brought it closer to a world that was listening. But war has never tolerated certainty. Somewhere along the journey, its anonymity nearly failed it. During a routine check near the Swiss border, a region crawling with spies in plain sight, a German officer pulled the crate aside for secondary inspection. He was not young. He was not lazy. He had seen enough war to distrust paperwork. He opened the box slowly, as if expecting something to flinch. His hands sifted more carefully than the last man's had. He lifted the bear and frowned, not in mockery, but in doubt. He pressed harder this time. Turned it over. Ran fingers across its back as though reading in braille. For several quiet seconds, the fate of lives rested in the tension between cloth and suspicion. And then, oddly, he smiled. The bear smelled of mildew, of dust, of age. It was pathetic, not dangerous. A relic of softness in a world that had no use for it. He tossed it back with faint disgust, as though offended by its presence, and returned to his paperwork. The crate rolled forward. and the bear kept going. Several days later, the crate crossed into neutral territory under the pretense of mercy. Switzerland had become one of the few places in Europe where borders still pretended to be human. Trains slowed. Paper mattered. Neutral watchers recorded names instead of erasing them. The bear arrived in a sorting room that did not belong to the Reich. Here, the air did not smell of authority. It smelled of paper, old wood, and cautious optimism. A clerk opened the crate and followed the listed address with care that felt unfamiliar. No stamp of domination. No barked orders. Just hands moving with quiet intention. The teddy bear was set aside not as trash, not as comedy but as a personal object meant to be returned. And from there it moved not through iron rails, but through whispered channels MI9 had carved into the map long before the war demanded them. In a small apartment overlooking a city that still slept behind drawn curtains, the bear finally reached a table lit by a shaded lamp. The man who picked it up did not treat it as worthless. He studied it, the way a bomb technician studies wire. Carefully. Respectfully. He ran his thumb along its seams and felt the subtle resistance beneath the cloth. Not certainty, but promise. The thread was cut cleanly. The fur gently opened. And hidden inside the body of a child's toy, the war breathed outward in paper fragments no larger than postage stamps. Microfilm. Slips of coded language. Pencil scratches mapped against memory. The intel itself did not scream. It whispered. But when intelligence whispers, nations lean in. Within hours, the bear's contents were undone, translated, cross-referenced with aerial photographs and intercepted transmissions. And slowly, the picture sharpened. Fuel storage locations validated from prisoner observation. Factory output confirmed what bombing raids had hinted at. Rail congestion exactly where pilots had suspected, but never proved. Even something as small as a shift in guard patterns at an airfield outside Leipzig was enough to alter flight paths that week. The information did not win the war. But it changed battles. And in war, that is often the same thing under another name. Back in the camp, the men who had sent the bear waited without knowing whether it still existed. There would be no confirmation. No message returned. Silence was success. If months passed without arrests, if compounds weren't shuttered, if the barracks was not dragged into dawn and torn apart, then maybe, just maybe, the bear had lived. For prisoners, information travelled one way outward, and hope crept back in like fog. Weeks later, bombing raids struck with eerie accuracy. Factories once shrouded in secrecy burned clean into visibility. Rail yards ground into chaos faster than planners in Berlin could adjust. Somewhere deep in the Reich, a commander stared at a map and knew something had gone wrong not tactically, but spiritually. The war was no longer happening only at the front. It was unravelling from inside. The teddy bear never appeared in a report. It earned no citation. It received no grave. But its brief life as a courier quietly echoed across skies filled with Allied bombers that now flew just a little less blind. And, as the war bled closer to its end, the consequences of silent intelligence began accumulating not in statistics, but in faces that never saw interrogation rooms, in pilots who returned home instead of vanishing into snow and wire. The bear had done its work, and the war would never know its name. Inside the camps, nothing changed at first, which was the surest sign that something had. No sirens cut through the dawn. No names were read from lists. No midnight boots echoed down the barrack aisles. The absence of reprisal was louder than any punishment. When Germany uncovered espionage, it did not hesitate. Camps were sealed, privileges stripped, entire prisoner populations punished for the sin of one unseen hand. But this time, nothing came. And in that void, the men began to understand the outcome without ever hearing it. The teddy bear had not been caught. And because it hadn't been caught, it had not been traced. And because it had not been traced, no one inside the wire had been compromised. This kind of success was not celebrated. It was endured. The men went on counting soup ladles, mending socks, staring at months carved into calendar scraps. But inside, something had shifted not into triumph, but into endurance sharpened with purpose. Across Germany, the Reich grew restless. By early 1944, intelligence leaks were no longer isolated irritants. They were changing the math of war. Allied bombing raids began showing uncanny precision. Rail intersections that had seemed unremarkable disappeared overnight. Factories the Germans had believed hidden were struck in eerily surgical ways. Oil reserves once dispersed carefully to avoid detection evaporated under high explosive detonations, guided by knowledge that could not have been seen from the air alone. German commanders whispered not about bombing strength, but about leakage. About voices traveling where they should not. About secrets moving without form. The idea that prisoners could be supplying intelligence was not new. But the idea that they were doing so with this level of efficiency, that unsettled even the hardened minds in Berlin. And so, the response came as all cornered regimes respond, not with restraint, but with escalation. Inspection protocols tightened brutally. Red Cross parcels were disassembled like engines. Clothing was shredded in front of prisoners. Toys vanished altogether, banned not by policy, but by instinctive mistrust. Religious texts were ripped down to their bindings. Even bread was sliced into pieces thin enough to reveal hidden slips. In some camps, correspondences were halted entirely for weeks. Men were isolated under suspicion without explanation. The Germans would not admit a teddy bear had beaten them, but they reacted as though something small and soft had become unforgivable. The very absurdity of it all enraged them. Yet no crackdown could reverse what was already known. Intelligence once released could not be undone. Rail movements already altered would stay altered. Bombers that avoided traps would not be undone by after-the-fact searches. The war does not pause for justice. It rewards timing, not confession. And the bear had moved in time. Among Allied intelligence circles, the flow of POW reports began to be quietly trusted more than ever. MI9 refined its systems based on what had not failed. Objects thought too personal to be dangerous became primary vehicles. Scripts were adjusted. Cryptography reshuffled. New concealment methods passed into training manuals that never bore the T of a chapter title. Word traveled in fragments. And confidence returned, not in victory, but in visibility. Allied planners began to feel they were no longer blind behind enemy lines. For the men still trapped inside wire, the change was subtler, but it was there. Morale is not a switch. It does not flip from black to light. But its absence is a gravity, and its return is a loosening. The men sat straighter. Jokes lasted longer. Plans floated as if seriousness itself had been interrupted. Somewhere, somehow, something they did had mattered. In a war that made people feel interchangeable, that was everything. And while the bear itself disappeared forever into records that were never kept, its footprint in history had already taken shape. But the greater transformation was still unfolding not only in camps or command centers, but in the war's psychology itself. As 1944 deepened into its brutal crescendo, the war began to breathe differently. On the surface, the Reich still thundered with authority banners, speeches, troop movements, but beneath it all ran a current of erosion. Intelligence failures gnawed at German strategy like rot in unseen beams. Operations misfired not because of inferior weapons, but because plans reached the battlefield already compromised. Convoys were intercepted with sickening regularity. Luftwaffe deployments arrived in skies already waiting for them. Factories rebuilt only to burn again under raids that struck where the ground had been told they would be safe. This was not coincidence. It was consequence. And although no report ever named the bear, its data had entered the nervous system of the Allied war machine like a new organ. Invisible. Indispensable. Inside camps, life tightened but did not break. Privileges were gone. Libraries thinned. The black market for favors with guards dissolved into silence. But intelligence did not stop moving, it simply adapted. Men memorized more. Trusted less. Timed everything. The bear had proven something poisonous to German authority. That security could be defeated not by infiltration, but by indifference. That a system trained to fear weapons could still drown in softness. This realization altered the logic of resistance. The important things would never look important. That lesson did not fade after 1945. It slipped into Cold War doctrine, into espionage schools, into the mathematics of surveillance that still governs modern conflict. Anywhere systems look for patterns, resistance hides in chaos. And for the men involved, history would not remember their hands or their names. They returned home skeletal and silent. Some seldom spoke of captivity. Others spoke incessantly, as though afraid that if the words stopped, the wire would return in their sleep. Their war did not end on paper. It ended in fragments, in smells that never fully faded, in the look of children's toys that held too much memory, in nights where soundlessness felt like threat. That bear, wherever it vanished to, carried away more than microfilm. It carried away something of the men who had sewn it shut, parts of themselves they would never entirely reclaim. In Allied archives, the reports it delivered were absorbed into binders, stamped TOP secret, and then gradually downgraded to dusty. Intelligence grows old quickly. Success is perishable. What saved lives one year becomes trivia the next. But human consequence does not degrade. A bombing rerouted because of one prisoner's sketch is not recorded in emotion, but it is preserved in families that never received telegrams, in towns that did not wake to fire, in children who met fathers who otherwise would have remained shadows on walls. This is not sentiment. It is arithmetic. The war is won not only by the dead, but by the living who were never counted as victories. By Germany's collapse in May 1945, the camps were torn open like rooms long sealed. Men stepped into sunlight with eyes unused to it. And no one carried bears with them. The small witnesses stayed behind, lost, discarded, burned or buried in storage rooms no one ever catalogued. But the truth they carried had already done its work. The war did not end because of a bear. But it ended in part through a million quiet small acts exactly like it. And when the world finally slowed enough to write history down, this story did not make the page. Because it wasn't loud enough for medals. But history, when read closely, still keeps room for whispers. War is remembered through thunder, through beaches and breakthroughs, through flags raised in smoke and silhouettes crossing wire. We teach ourselves to look for victory in photographs. But the war beneath the war is quieter. It hides inside rooms with their lights drawn low. Inside hands that tremble without cameras to capture them. Inside objects that were never meant to be dangerous, but became so because nothing else was left. The teddy bear was not brave. It did not choose its role. It did not know war. And yet, it carried it. Inside soft stuffing and careless stitching, it held pieces of a world tearing itself apart. Not because it was special, but because it was ordinary. That is the uncomfortable lesson history leaves behind, that the most powerful instruments are rarely the loud ones. They are the things no one suspects. The things no one celebrates. The things thrown aside. No monument will be built for a toy. No parade will march in honor of thread. But lives were changed because someone trusted something small. Because desperation gave birth to patience instead of rage. Because men trapped inside wire decided that meaning was more dangerous than metal. And so they sent it away, wrapped in fabric and memory. History does not preserve softness well. It favors iron and fire. But real war is often won by those who move silently through the margins, by those who leave nothing behind except consequences. And somewhere in the blank spaces between official records, a forgotten bear still walks across Europe sewn shut with secrets, and remembered only by the silence it saved.